There is a ritual happening right now across the Muslim world so deeply embedded in religious identity that to question it feels like an act of apostasy. Families drowning in debt are borrowing money they cannot repay. Children are used as emotional instruments to justify the purchase. Animals are paraded through city streets like celebrities. Makeshift slaughterhouses appear on every residential corner. Blood runs in urban gutters. And hanging over all of it, the full, crushing weight of religious obligation. Do this, or you are a sinner before God. But here is the question nobody in a pulpit will ask. What if the Quran never commanded any of it? Not the date, not the animal, not the obligation on every household, not the house-to-house slaughter, not even the framework that makes this a religious act at all. How does something absent from the Quran become one of the most financially coercive, emotionally manipulative religious obligations the Muslim world has ever seen? That is what this video is going to take apart. And the further you go, the more you will realize this is not a minor scholarly disagreement about jurisprudence. This is a question about whether human beings have placed their own traditions above the Book of Allah and called it religion. Now look at the verses that defenders of the ritual actually use to argue it is Quranic, because this is where precision matters enormously. The primary verses pointed to are in chapter 22, the chapter dealing with Hajj. In verse 36, the Arabic word used for the large animals in those verses is budn, which refers to large animals, specifically camels, not goats, not cows per household across the entire Muslim world, camels brought to a specific location. Read the full context. From chapter 22, verse 26 onward, God is describing the establishment of the house, its proclamation to humanity, the people who come from every distant pass. Then in verse 33, the text speaks of benefit in these animals, transport, sustenance, and then their arriving at their appointed place. What is that place? The verse answers directly, al-Bayt al-Atiq, the ancient house. This is a description of the Hajj gathering. Hundreds of thousands of people converge on one location. They bring animals. The animals serve multiple practical purposes throughout the journey: transport, food, sustenance. At the conclusion of this gathering, those animals are slaughtered to feed the gathering. This is the most natural reading of every verse in that chapter about animals. It is a description of provisions for a massive communal assembly, not a commandment for every Muslim household on earth to independently perform a slaughter ritual in their front yard on a fixed date. And then comes chapter 22, verse 37, the verse that effectively ends the theological argument before it even begins. God says plainly, their flesh does not reach God, their blood does not reach God. What reaches God is your taqwa, your God consciousness, your moral awareness, your inner orientation toward truth and justice. Read that verse again slowly. God is directly telling you the physical act of slaughter accomplishes nothing in the sight of God. Nothing. The flesh is irrelevant to him. The blood is irrelevant to him. This verse is not just a passing spiritual reminder. It is a direct doctrinal statement about what the nature of sacrifice means and does not mean. If the blood does not reach God, why has an entire religious economy been built on the premise that shedding blood is an act of worship? This verse is actually doing something more significant than people recognize. It is correcting a theology. It is dismantling the ancient pagan framework that believed divine beings were pleased and appeased by blood. That framework, the idea that slaughter is currency for divine favor, is not Islamic theology. It is pre-Abrahamic, pre-monotheistic religion. And the Quran is explicitly pushing back against it, right there in the middle of the chapter about Hajj. And this theology of blood appeasement is not something new. It goes back thousands of years. The Aztecs tore beating hearts from living human bodies on pyramid altars. The Phoenicians burned their children to their god Moloch. The Canaanites, the Mesopotamians, the Greeks, the Romans all sacrificed humans to appease their gods, before transitioning to animal substitutions. Same pattern all across civilization. As moral consciousness develops, the animal replaces the human. Starting to sound familiar? And yet the God of the Quran looked at all of this and said, "The blood does not reach me." Now consider the date, the 10th of Dhul Hijjah. Where does that come from? Not from the Quran. The Quran speaks of the days of Hajj in general terms. Chapter 2 verse 197 mentions the well-known months of Hajj. Chapter 22 doesn't specify a calendar date for household slaughter across the Muslim world. The 10th of Dhul Hijjah, as the specific obligatory date for the sacrifice ritual, comes entirely from man-made hadith literature. Traditions written down more than 2 centuries after the Prophet, with fabricated chains of transmission by the scholars within the hadith, weak or unverifiable. We are not even going to get into how skewed the Hijri calendar is. For that, watch my video, The Hijri Calendar is Broken. These so-called scholars who spent their lives cataloguing and rubber-stamping these narrations made clear that the majority of narrations describing the spiritual rewards and obligations of the animal sacrifice ritual do not meet the evidentiary standards those scholars themselves invented. The spectacular promises, the narrations describing what happens for each hair of the sacrificed animal, the bridges built to paradise, are unverifiable even by the standards of the tradition that produced them. So this obligation is totally made up. The date is non-Quranic. And the location, every household across the Muslim world, directly contradicts the Quranic verse that places the slaughter at al-Bayt al-Atiq. If the Quran says the appointed place for this animal is the ancient house, and you are slaughtering it in a residential suburb of London or Lagos, you are not following the Quran. You are following an interpretation of traditions that were never authentically established. That is, if a sacrifice is required in the first place at all. Now to the foundational story, because everything rests on this, the story of Abraham and his son, the near sacrifice. This is the bedrock justification for the entire ritual, the claim that God commanded Abraham to slaughter his son, that Abraham was willing, and that the annual sacrifice commemorates that willingness. Take the story apart from the Quran itself. The story is in chapter 37, the chapter called As-Safat. Read carefully. Abraham says to his son, "I see in a manam that I am slaughtering you." Then he asks his son, "What do you see?" The son replies, and this is crucial, he consents. He says, "Father, do what you have been commanded to do. You will find me, God willing, among the patient ones." The Bible has its own version of this story, with its own cast of characters and its own theological agenda. That version entered Islamic tradition not through revelation, but through the same hadith collections that established the sacrifice ritual itself. It arrived in a package from outside the Quran, was absorbed into hadith literature, and then reversed engineered into the Quranic passage as if God had placed it there. This is one of the clearest examples of how biblical and extra-Quranic material infiltrated Islamic practice and was subsequently treated as if it were part of the original revelation. That should disturb anyone who takes the Quran seriously as a self-sufficient and self-interpreting text. Now the word manam. The Quran actually interprets this word for you within the same chapter. Look at chapter 37, verse 105. After the resolution of the story, God says to Abraham, "You have fulfilled the ru'ya." He does not say you fulfilled the manam. He says ru'ya. And ru'ya in the Quran is never simply a nighttime dream. Go to chapter 12, the entire chapter of Joseph. Joseph's ru'ya is his inner vision, his prophetic understanding of the trajectory of his life. When he sees the sun and moon and 11 stars prostrating, that is called ru'ya. And nobody takes it to mean he is literally waiting for celestial bodies to bow to him physically. It is a vision of destiny, a deep seeing of where the path leads. In chapter 48, verse 27, God tells the prophet about a ru'ya that would be fulfilled, a vision of entering the sacred mosque in safety. It was called ru'ya, even though it was a future reality, a certainty seen before it happened. In chapter 17, verse 60, a ru'ya is described as a trial for people, a vision with symbolic importance, not a literal scene to be physically enacted. The Quran in chapter 37, verse 105, uses ru'ya when it tells Abraham he has fulfilled his vision. That is the definitive Quranic explanation of what manam meant in Abraham's experience. It was a deep inner conviction, a prophetic understanding of where his path was leading, not a literal instruction to perform a human sacrifice. Allah, who says that killing one innocent soul is equivalent to killing all of humanity, chapter 5, verse 32, does not then command the killing of an innocent soul as a loyalty test. The theological coherence of the Quran demands this interpretation. Let that point stand on its own for a moment. Chapter 5, verse 32 is among the most powerful moral declarations in the Quran. God says, "Whoever kills a soul, it is as if they have killed all of humanity. One life equals all of humanity in the sight of God." This is not a peripheral verse. This is a foundational ethical principle embedded deep in the revelation. A God who states this principle does not then demand the slaughter of an innocent child as proof of devotion. These two positions cannot occupy the same theology. One of them must be misunderstood. And since chapter 22, verse 37 already tells us God is not interested in blood, the answer is clear. So what actually happened between Abraham and his son? Read the Arabic of chapter 37 carefully. The word for the son, having reached an appropriate age, is balagha ma'ahu sa'ya. He reached with him the sa'i. Sa'i means effort, striving, the capacity for purposeful action. This is not a small child. This is a person old enough to have an independent mission, old enough to reason, to consent, to join a cause. Abraham does not force him. He tells him what he has seen and asks what the son thinks. The son consents willingly. Both of them submit. The Arabic falamma aslama is dual. Two people in mutual agreement. This is not a scene of a man restraining a helpless child. This is two people who have agreed to a difficult divine purpose. Then watelhu lil jabin, traditionally translated as he laid him down on his forehead. But examine the Arabic components. The word jabin, carries two meanings. One is the forehead, which because it is raised and forward-facing also connotes elevation, nobility, a high or lofty station. The second meaning from the same root, jaban, is weakness, cowardice. A jabin can also mean a weak, timid, or oppressed group of people. The Arabic preposition la means for, in purpose. So the phrase means, he positioned him for the jabin, for the noble mission, or alternatively, he sent him toward the weak and the vulnerable. This second reading is completely consistent with the entire arc of what Abraham's family does in the Quran. They build in desolate places. They serve humanity in difficult conditions. They establish communities where none existed. Sending a son into service for those who cannot help themselves is the most natural reading of this passage, given everything else the Quran says about the Abrahamic mission. Then وَفَدَيْنَاهُ بِذِبْحٍ عَظِيمٍ. Traditionally, we ransomed him with a great slaughter. And here, centuries of interpretation have inserted a ram descending from the sky, despite the Quran mentioning no such ram anywhere in the text. The word dhib is the noun form of the root meaning to slaughter, to cut, to sever. But it also carries the meaning of something given up, something sacrificed in the broader sense. A great dhib, a magnificent sacrifice was made. And immediately after, God says, we left his remembrance among the later ones. The great sacrifice was the life of service, the sending of the son into the mission, the willingness to separate from what was most beloved for the sake of what God commanded. That is the great dhib, not a ram materializing from thin air. There is no ram in the Quran, not in this passage. Search for it. It is not there. The ram enters the story from other textual traditions from outside the Quran and has been retroactively inserted into Quranic interpretation to justify a practice that needed divine sanction. And then, وَتَرَكْنَا عَلَيْهِ فِي الْآخِرِينَ, we left upon him among the later ones. Traditionalists say this means God perpetuated the animal sacrifice ritual through future generations. But go to chapter 37, verse 119. The identical phrase appears word for Moses and Aaron. Go further. The same phrase appears for Elijah. Each time it refers to preserving the mention, the mission, the example, not a specific ritual. The pattern across the entire chapter makes this unmistakably clear. God preserved the memory and the legacy of the prophets as guidance for those who come later. That is the inheritance. That is what was left in the later ones. Not a date-specific slaughter obligation. Now apply the definition of sunnah, the example meant to be followed, to the claim that the annual animal sacrifice is the sunnah of Abraham. Sunnah, in any coherent use of the word, means replicating what someone did in the same way under the same conditions for the same purpose. If Abraham's act was sending his mature son on a divine mission, the replication of that sunnah is sending your family in service of God's cause on this earth. not purchasing a goat on the 10th of Dhul Hijjah. If Abraham's act happened outside of Dhul Hijjah, which cannot be established from the Quran, then performing a ritual in Dhul Hijjah is not following his sunnah. If the animal involved was described as a ram, not a cow, not a goat, then slaughtering a cow is not following his sunnah. Every link in the fabricated chains breaks under examination. And if the claim is Abrahamic sunnah, then consider this. Judaism and Christianity both trace their origins to Abraham. Both traditions venerate him as a central patriarch. Both communities have books describing his life, his covenant, his family. And a similar story exists in both religions. But if God had established through Abraham an annual animal sacrifice ritual that all his spiritual descendants were obligated to perform on a specific date, there would be some trace of it in those traditions. There is none. The Jews do not perform an annual house-to-house slaughter to honor Abraham's near sacrifice of his son. The Christians do not. Two entire Abrahamic traditions with deep connections to Abraham, his family, and his covenant, and neither carries this practice. But somehow a practice begun in post-Quranic tradition is being presented as an eternal Abrahamic commandment. The argument falls apart. In countries where the house-to-house slaughter culture is most intense, the ritual has become primarily a vehicle for social performance, and in doing so it has achieved something theologically catastrophic. It has transformed what is supposed to be an act of taqwa into its precise opposite. Taqwa is inner God consciousness. It is humility before God, sincerity of intention, the unseen quality of the heart that chapter 22 verse 37 says is the only thing that actually reaches him. But what does this ritual look like in practice? The size of the animal you purchase signals your economic status to your community. A larger bull means more prestige. Multiple animals means extraordinary prestige. Neighbors compare. People feel genuine shame if their animal is smaller. The animal is walked through streets before slaughter, displayed. Photographs are staged and posted before the knife is raised. The sacrifice has become a status symbol. And a status symbol is the literal inversion of taqwa. Taqwa is between you and God, invisible, unperformable, unpostable. The moment your sacrifice is primarily about what your neighbors see, what your family thinks, what image you project to your social circle, it has already stopped being a sacrifice and a performance to keep up with the Joneses instead. And when the slaughter is done, who actually benefits? The Quran speaks in various places about genuine charity, about reaching those in real need, the genuinely poor, the stranded traveler, the person without recourse. The traditional framework for the sacrifice divides the meat into thirds. 1/3 for the household, 1/3 for relatives and friends, 1/3 for the poor. But in practice, the relatives and friends receiving a third are almost always in the same economic bracket as the household giving it. The social exchange is horizontal, rather than vertical, from those with resources to those without. The genuinely destitute frequently receive what remains after the social obligations of kinship and neighborliness have been fulfilled. Sometimes they receive nothing at all because they are not known to the household performing the sacrifice. So this excuse of doing it to feed the poor also does not hold up. What good does a small portion of meat do for a poor household? Maybe feed them for one meal? Wouldn't it better to hand over the amount spent on an animal instead? Not to mention the fact that during this time, prices for sacrificial animals skyrocket, double, triple the cost of the actual price, if not more. Also consider what the animals themselves experience. Urban environments, unfamiliar with the noise and density of city life, experience significant distress during the period of their captivity and their slaughter. Many escape and are maimed or even killed in accidents. Trained butchers performing humane slaughter under controlled conditions is a different matter entirely from amateur household slaughter performed once a year in residential streets. The conditions in which millions of animals are slaughtered during this period would constitute animal abuse under the laws of most countries, and the Quran in chapter 6, verse 38, reminds believers that animals are communities like humanity with their own integrity before God. The business dimension is equally worth examining. The cattle trade around this ritual is an enormous commercial enterprise. Prices spike dramatically. Animals are bred, raised and sold specifically for this season. Entire breeds are imported and bred just for this. The bigger and more good-looking the animal, the more money it fetches. The economic pressure on families is not incidental. It is built into the market that has developed around the ritual. When a religious practice becomes a commercial industry of this scale, it is worth asking who profits from the perpetuation of the obligation and who suffers from it. And then there is the method itself. The Zabiyah method does not appear in the Quran. Every detail comes from Hadith literature. The claim that it is the most humane and painless method of slaughter is not a scientific finding. Actual science says the opposite in terms of pain response and time to loss of consciousness in large animals. Cutting major blood vessels produces rapid physiological collapse, but not immediate loss of sensation. And the claim that it produces cleaner, more blood-free meat has no clear scientific basis either, since residual blood remains in muscle tissues regardless of exsanguination method. But the question that exposes this entire claim most completely is this. If this truly is the most humane way of taking a life, why has not a single Muslim-majority country adopted it for capital punishment? From decapitation to hanging to the firing squad, these are the methods in use today. Mankind has spent 300 years trying to answer the question of how to humanely execute a person, from the guillotine to lethal injection, and the debate is still not settled. Nobody looked at Zabiyah and said, "Ah, yes, this is the answer." That silence tells you everything. And as with all things Hadith, once you pull one thread, the whole thing unravels. The disputes within Hadith tradition about the most basic parameters of this ritual are also telling. How many days is the sacrifice period valid? Some scholars said 2 days, some said 3, some said 4. One scholarly opinion extended it to the entire month of Dhul Hijjah. There is no narration attributed to the Prophet himself that establishes the 3-day window as definitive. The 3-day period derives from statements attributed to companions, not to the Prophet, and different companions said different things. The dispute was never resolved. The 3-day period simply became the default through repetition. Which animals are valid for sacrifice? In Hadith books themselves, narrations record companions saying they saw no problem with a chicken. Others restricted it to specific domesticated livestock. The conditions an animal must meet, age thresholds, physical characteristics, absence of defects, were elaborated across centuries of legal commentary, each generation adding further specifications. None of these specifications appear in the Quran. None. And yet people worry earnestly whether their animals' ears are the right shape for God to accept the offering, while ignoring Quranic commands that are explicit and unambiguous. This is what happens when human tradition is treated as binding religious law without Quranic foundation. The tradition accumulates detail. It grows more elaborate. It becomes more demanding. It generates more obligation and more shame for non-compliance. The people who benefit from the elaboration, economically, socially, institutionally, have every incentive to insist on its divine origin. And the people without the knowledge or the standing to question it are caught in a system of pressure they did not create and cannot easily escape. The Quran directly addresses the dynamic of following inherited religious practice without examination. Chapter 2, verse 170, is one of the most pointed verses in the entire book. When told to follow what God has revealed, people say, "We will follow what we found our fathers doing." God's response through the prophet is, even if their fathers understood nothing and were not guided. This verse is not addressed to a specific historical community. It is addressed to the universal human tendency to treat inherited practice as sacred simply because it is inherited. The verse is a standing challenge, across all time, to anyone who performs a religious act because community and tradition demand it, rather than because God's book commands it. There is a category of inherited religious practice that survives precisely because people do not ask direct questions about its Quranic foundation. The moment you ask, "Show me the verse that commands this specifically," the entire structure becomes fragile. Show me the Quranic verse that says every household on earth must slaughter an animal on the 10th of Dhul Hijjah. Show me the verse where God says the size or species or physical condition of the animal determines the acceptability of the offering. Show me where the Quran says the blood of an animal reaching the ground is an act of worship. It is not there. And the absence is not ambiguous. The Quran is a detailed book. When God commands something specifically and repeatedly, prayer, the giving of a portion of wealth to those in need, honoring contracts, treating parents with kindness, maintaining justice, those commands appear with clarity and frequency. The animal sacrifice obligation, with all its elaborate specificity, is absent from the Book of God. Chapter 2, verse 177 defines righteousness comprehensively, and the definition is striking in what it includes and excludes. Righteousness is not turning your face toward east or west. It is not the ritual orientation of the body. It is believing in God, in the last day, in the angels, in the book, in the prophets. It is giving wealth, despite loving it, to relatives, to orphans, to the needy, to the traveler, to those who ask. It is freeing people from bondage. It is keeping promises. It is patience in adversity. This is the Quran's definition of righteousness. Ritual slaughter does not appear in it. Chapter 90 verses 12 through 17 describes the difficult uphill path, the path of true virtue. And again, the Quran's answer is unmistakable. It is freeing a slave. It is feeding on a day of hunger, an orphan near in relation, a person in grinding misery. It is being among those who believe and urge one another to patience and compassion. This is the closeness God wants. This is the drawing near God asks for. When you give wealth you love to people genuinely in need, every day of every month. That is sacrifice. When you stand for truth at a cost to yourself, that is sacrifice. When you refuse to perform a ritual that has no Quranic basis, despite the social pressure bearing down on you from family and community, that is sacrifice. When you take money you would have spent on an animal and direct it instead to a family that cannot feed their children, or a person crushed under medical debt, that is the drawing near to God that the Quran actually describes. Abraham's legacy in the Quran is not an annual blood ritual. His legacy is monotheism when it was dangerous. It is building a gathering place for humanity in a desolate valley. It is submitting to God's commands when they were costly and countercultural. It is raising a family that carried the message of justice and divine consciousness forward. Chapter 16 verse 120 describes him as a nation in himself, devoutly obedient to God, a man of pure faith, not among those who associated other things with God. The chapter says God chose him and guided him to a straight path. Nowhere in the Quran's extensive portrait of Abraham does God say, "And because of his willingness to follow my command, I want every Muslim for all time to slaughter an animal once a year on a specific date." That conclusion is a human addition. It is not revelation. The ritual as it exists and as it is practiced has become a mechanism of social control. Religious obligation is asserted, shame is weaponized for non-compliance, financial harm is inflicted on people least able to absorb it. The actual beneficiaries are the commercial trade built around the season and the religious authority reinforced by the obligation. And the genuine poor, who the Quran never stops calling believers to remember, receive at best the leftovers of a social performance directed primarily at demonstrating wealth and community membership. If you want to take from this the deepest Quranic challenge it holds for you, here it is. God is not appeased by blood. That is stated explicitly. God measures your taqwa, your inner moral consciousness, your justice in action, your genuine care for the created world. The Quran asks you to sacrifice your comfort, your social standing, your ego, your attachment to inherited practice when that practice contradicts His word. The Quran asks you to look at what your tradition has added to His book and to have the courage to say, this addition is not from God. That honesty, the willingness to question what you have been told is sacred, to hold it up against the Quran directly and follow what the Quran actually says, rather than what community pressure demands. That is the kind of sacrifice God is describing when He says what reaches Him is your taqwa. Not the blood. Never the blood. The blood does not reach Him. He told you so Himself.